Friends, today we are going to continue with the analysis of tragedy, where Aristotle has mentioned, and even we have discussed yesterday, the six different constituents of tragedy. And then the last constituent he talked and he discussed is spectacle as a low priority is given to spectacle, mentioning that spectacle is basically the responsibility of stage manager or director when it has been performed on the stage. So in this case, if you see it very carefully, that what Aristotle is pointing out in analysis of tragedy, he's pointing out the six different constituents. Now, more strikingly, or perhaps we can say that it is a relatively low priority as he has given to spectacle in the six constituents of tragedy. Similarly, Aristotle gives a low priority to the verbal text of tragedy also. That is what we have to remember, that is what we have to understand. If poetry were defined as composition in verse, this downrating of the linguistic text would be impossible to defend. Now, you cannot defend it. But Aristotle has firmly rejected this in chapter number 1. And from his perspective, the lower priority he has given to language makes certain sense. Because if you remember, he specifically mentioned that rhythmical language is tragedy's medium. Why? Because we have also discussed that rhythm and melody is basic instinct of human nature. And that's why rhythmical language is tragedy's medium. And it is a means to tragedy's end. Because insistence was given to the rhythmical language if you want to make the tragedy in Aristotelian concept good, then you have to understand the use of language also. And that end, what we talked about, is being imitation of an action. Because if you see very carefully, what is being imitated in any form of drama, and if you consider this as tragedy, it is an imitation of action that is the priority Aristotle has given in the form of plot. Now, when there is primacy given to plot, and if the rhythmical language is not used, then the tragedy is, he is saying that it is end. It is not beginning, it is end of the tragedy. And this end is nothing but a beginning of, it is being, the end is being of imitation of action. Let me elaborate it a little bit to you. Why this is imitation of action? Because in day to day life, in our regular life, we never use rhythmical language continuously. The use of language in day to day life does not carry the whole idea of rhythm. That's why, if we are talking about imitation of action, then naturally we have to consider about the use of language also. Now, if you understand this, that from this, it is a reasonable inference that the choice of action is to be imitated, and that is most crucial because plot is the most elementary constituent of any tragedy. Now, how you achieve the tragedy's effect, then the way in which the imitation is realized in words. You have to understand that what sort of action you are trying to imitate. Accordingly, you have to choose the words for that particular action. Now, we are not denying that what Aristotle said, that rhythmical language is basically tragedy's medium. We are not denying this. But if there is some incompetent composer of verse, then naturally the whole tragic plot or well chosen tragic plot can be ruined. And that's why we have to understand this very crucial fact that rhythmical language may enhance the action, makes the audience to get close with that particular plot. And that's why rhythmical language is tragedy's medium. But the language which is used in tragedy is there to help realize the plot's potential. That is the role of the language used in tragedy, to help plots potential, and in that sense we can say that language is subordinate to plot or secondary to the plot. That means Aristotle's argument is for the primacy of plot, and this primacy of plot, the arguments that are primarily arguments for the primacy of plot over rest of the things, including over the character also. Please understand the chronological analysis that Aristotle, or chronological way that Aristotle had pointed out, that there is plot first, then character, then reasoning, then diction, then lyrics, and then spectacle. That means primary is plot, and he begins by claiming that tragedy is not an imitation of persons, but of actions and of life. Now, the reason he gives for this particular claim, That tragedy is not an imitation of persons, but of action and of life. For this, he gives certain reasons. The reason he gives is that of good and bad fortunes. You can say it is well being and ill being. As Aristotle usually puts it, well being and ill being, highlighting the contrast in the whole Greek understanding by unusual choice of word for misfortune. He used unusual choice for misfortune. Now, the good and bad fortune, it also depends on action. Suppose an outstandingly talented person is not necessarily outstandingly successful. Have you ever find this type of equation rules in the society? Outstandingly talented persons are always outstandingly successful? No, not essential that they are going to be successful. Talents have to be exercised. If you don't exercise talents, then you are not going to get success. Success never depends on the talent which you possess. You have to exercise the talent to achieve success. And that's why Aristotle observes that in an athletic competition, the prize is not awarded to the athlete who is best in condition, but the prize is given to that athlete who comes first in that competition. Physically, I may be very fit, physically, I may be very perfect for that athletic competition. But what is the criteria of that athletic competition? The criteria of athletic competition is that you have to win it, you have to come first. Then and then you will back the pride. Otherwise, whatever your physique may be, you will not able to get that particular prize. We can speak of success and failure only in relation to the exercise of someone's abilities. You're good, you understand the words better, your perception is very perfect, very proper. But when you exercise these things in your examination, then and then you are going to get good marks. Otherwise, you cannot say, I am good in logic, I am good in rational, I am good in understanding. Why don't I treat it? Always, why don't I get good marks? Why don't I be treated as a talented person? Because my logic and reasoning is good. I can understand what sir is saying. You have to exercise your talent. And if you exercise your talent, you exercise your ability, and the outcome of this exercise will not be determined by the person's abilities alone. It is not going to be determined by the person's ability, but is also influenced by the opportunities they have at that time, and so forth. They'll get the success. I'm having ability, I'm exercising my ability, everything is right, everything is correct, but you need to have an opportunity. You can write well, you can understand well, you have ability to writing well, but you need an opportunity to write in an examination. Everything is fine, your ability is so good, you are exercising your ability, all these two things come together very properly, It is coming very properly, but on the day of examination you fell ill and you lost that opportunity. What will you do about your exercising ability and your own ability? You are exercising your ability very well. You are having your personal ability is very good, but on the day of examination, the thing which you are carrying like a pen or whatever things you are carrying to write down, that doesn't work on that day. You require an opportunity also. That means if you understand this particular relation, that person's ability doesn't make him successful. Person's ability has to be exercised, and if the ability is being exercised, then his talent is to be utilized for that. But for doing all those things, he required a proper opportunity. Then and then it is possible for him to get some sort of success in his life. In this sense, in the same sense, we can say that it is action and not only character that determines success or failure. It is action that determines success and failure of tragedy. And it should be noted that Greek word praxis, Praxis, Greek word praxis has a wide range of meanings than its conventional English translation. Please understand this. What is the conventional English translation of praxis is action. But the praxis is having wide range of meanings. If you're using it as a corresponding verb, you need to understand how it works there. If I say, what are you doing? Or how are you? Now, if you understand praxis with the questions that I asked right now, what are you doing or how are you? If praxis means action, not just in that sense of what someone does, what are you doing, that what I asked. I'm not asking what are you doing means what sort of thing you are doing right now. But I'm asking in the sense that how fair you are doing. I know. When I'm asking how are you, when you answer it that I'm good or good. Now the sense is that how are you, it doesn't mean that whether you are bad or whether you are good or whether what you are doing. What good means, your answer good means the person who is asking a question knows everything about you, and that context which he is having with the question, accordingly you answer to that particular question. That means action or praxis, the word used by Aristotle, is not simply translated as an action, but it is more than that. That in the sense of what someone does, or also in the sense that how they fare. Aristotle in chapter number 11 says that suffering, for that he used word pathos. Suffering is an action. Pathos is praxis that involves destruction or pain. Pathos is a sort of action that involves pain. Now, the apparent paradox in describing suffering as an action disappears when one takes account of the meaning of the word praxis in a very broader sense. If you are taking meaning of action in a broader sense, then you will be able to understand that pathos is an action, suffering is an action. Otherwise, commonly we may get confused that how suffering is to be considered as an action. It is relatively something different activity. But if suffering is an action that involves destruction or pain, in that sense, we have to understand that praxis has got a very broader sense. Action has a very broader sense to understand. And therefore, the success of any tragedy depends on, or failure of any tragedy depends on action only. Now, when success and failure depend on action, why does Aristotle refer to success or failure? How action leads to success and failure? That means when you are using the word success and failure, in that sense, you have to understand very interesting fact that there is going to be something which has to be rewarded, because success and failure, these two words are nothing but replication of rewards. It is a reward. If you do this, you will be successful. That means if you do this action, you will get this. That is this sort of reward. If you do this action, if you don't do it properly, then you will be failed. Failed means you are not going to get it. It is a sort of punishment that you are not getting it because of your wrong action. That means success and failure in all the sense depends on action that we used to follow, that we used to have. And if you carefully see the definition of tragedy, if you understand the definition of tragedy, you will find out that this definition of tragedy leads in further that tragedy affects or tragedy affects through pity and fear. Tragedy affects through pity and fear the purification of such emotions. What is the ultimate result of tragedy? Why we should watch tragedy? Why we should read tragedy? Because tragedy will purify your emotions. How? Through pity and fear. Now, if we return once again to another word which somehow need to understand very carefully, is that the ultimate result of tragedy lies with purification. And for purification, what word is used is called as catharsis. Purification of soul. How it is possible? How you are going to have purification of soul? Purification of soul through pity and fear. How pity and fear? Pity and fear will be aroused by imitating an action. Now, if you see, purification is nothing but it is a response of pity and fear. What pity and fear will lead? What sort of response you will get because of pity and fear? You will get purification of soul. And that's why we need to understand that tragedy is an imitation of action, and imitation of action which will lead to the events that evoke pity and fear. Now, these emotions of pity and fear are responses to success and failure. For example, we pity the talented person who is prevented by adverse circumstances from achieving the success. We feel pity for him. That yes, he's talented person, he's a talented student who can able to get good marks in examinations, but due to adverse circumstances, he was not able to achieve this. In that sense, you feel pity for that talented person. Now, note very carefully here that in Aristotle's view, we do not pity someone for a lack of talent. We're not feeling pity for the person who is not talented. We are feeling pity for the person who is talented. We do not pity someone for a lack of talent, but it is the lack of person who fails. Then when the failure is in keeping with person's ability, the failure is related with the ability of the person to perform that talent. That means we are not pitying for the talent of the person. He is talented, we know it. Why we are feeling pity? Because he was not able to apply it. We are talking about the ability of the person to use that particular talent. For that we feel pity. So Aristotle's first argument for the primacy of plot, we can say in these words that tragedy aims to excite fear and pity. These emotions are responses to success and failure. Success and failure depends on action. Hence, action is the most essential thing in tragedy, and therefore, plot is the most important element of tragedy. It is a simple equation, mathematical equation. I'll repeat once again this mathematical equation. That tragedy, this is what why plot is most primacy, why plot is most primary, why plot is most essential, why plot is most important to make tragedy or to bring tragedy to its real success. Aristotle's first argument is this, this equation that tragedy aims to excite pity and fear. Why pity and fear? For the purgation, for the purification of soul, catharsis. Tragedy aims at catharsis or purification of soul. How this purification of soul will take place? It has to excite pity and fear. And these emotions are responses to success and failure. Success and failure depends on action. Hence, action is the most essential thing in tragedy, and therefore, plot is the most important element of tragedy. This is the very first argument Aristotle put about tragedy in the analysis. I hope that you are getting what exactly this argument means by, because we have started to discuss that Aristotle has given certain priorities in defining the constituents of tragedy. And in those priorities, in deciding the constituents of tragedies, he has given the first and foremost priority to plot and second priority to character. That means plot is over and above than character. Why? Because it is related with action. It carries whole action. It means by action. And that's why the ultimate aim of tragedy, what tragedy means by, what tragedy requires, what tragedy will reach, how tragedy will get the things to be done. Tragedy will get all the things. Tragedies aim to excite pity and fear. These emotions are responses to success and failure. Success and failure depends on action. Hence, action is the most essential thing in tragedy. Therefore, plot is the most important element, the primary constituent of tragedy. Now, the second argument approaches from the opposite direction. What is this opposite direction? That tragedy is impossible without plot. But it is possible without character. Tragedy is impossible without plot, but it is possible without character. If character is dispensable, it cannot be important as plot. This is what the second argument, which is reaching from opposite direction, that plot is primary, plot is important. Now, the idea of drama without depiction of character may seem to us a little bit surprising, that how it is possible that without character, how a drama can able to. Now, in the context of the dichotomy of character and reasoning that we have seen yesterday, the implication is a play in which action arises out of people's perception of, people are having their own perception, and the action arises out of people's perception and reasoning about the possibilities of situation. There are possibilities of situations, because if there are no possibilities of situation, then we are not able to understand what sort of moral disposition that it will take place. And that's why action reasoning about the possibilities of situation without any impression being conveyed of the underlying moral disposition. Because when you are reading a text or when you are watching any tragedy at that time, you are simply understanding the what sort of different possibilities of the situation that you are watching with, without knowing that where it will reach, how it will reach. Knowledge of an individual's character, knowledge of an individual's character is not essential to understand what sort of actions they will take. Because when we start watching a play, when we start reading a play, we are almost stranger to that particular character. That particular character is not known to me before going with that particular play, going with that particular tragedy, if I use an Aristotelian term itself. Now, this stranger, because you are not at all interested in getting knowledge, any knowledge of that individual character, individual hero in the play. But you recognize, you start to understand that character with the sort of actions that he performed there, the sort of actions, the sort of praxis he carried throughout. We start to understand as a complete stranger, we start to recognize that particular character through the action, which gives some sort of sense, or somehow we are perplexed because apparently what we think about the possibility that this will happen, this possibility is there because of this action. If this does not achieve, in that condition we are in a mode of, we are in the condition of perplex, we are in perplexed condition situation, we are not able to understand what exactly it means by, because from a stranger to recognition, when you are entering to watch the play, you are absolutely stranger with the character, but when you get out of the hall, you have recognized that particular character, or you are not interested, you are not liking that character. So in a tragedy without character, motivation would be handled impersonally. That is what someone would do in this situation. If the situation, like as we are familiar with Sophoclean play Oedipus, or as we familiar with for understanding, for the sake of our own understanding, if we what sort of play we know the play of Hamlet and the Shakespearean play of Hamlet. If you consider yourself in the position of Hamlet, what would you do? There may be some different possibilities. You may not do what Hamlet did, placing ourselves into that particular position, placing ourselves into that particular situation. Now, what tragedy without character, motivation would be handled impersonally on one hand, rather than, you can say, handling it concretely, that yes, this has to be done by the character, This is the set of characters that would do this particular thing. Aristotle does not suggest that tragedy would be as good as tragedy with character. Please understand this. What Aristotle is pointing out, he is not suggesting that a tragedy, such a tragedy, which is without character's motivation, would be handled impersonally rather than concretely. Aristotle do not suggest that such tragedy would be as good as a tragedy with character. In fact, we know from the discussion of Homer's treatment of character that he would pointed out that there is some sort of action. There is some sort of action, and that's why Homer's epic pointed out towards dramatic narrative. Because this action makes you to get close with character. Character, for example, appearing in front of you without having any sort of action. The events that take place in his life, which makes us little bit familiar, which makes us little bit close, which makes us little bit confused, which makes us to appreciate, which makes us to reject. A stranger to recognition, a journey from a strange person's understanding to recognition of that particular person. If you look at all these positions that Aristotle is talking about, Aristotle is pointing that tragedy is possible in principle. Tragedy is possible in principle in the way the plot is. Characters cannot be essential in tragedy if they are not performing what the plot is. And that's why character is getting secondary status in whole tragedy. Because when the audience is reaching, when the audience is coming, when the audience is reaching to the auditorium to watch that particular tragedy, the audience is not at all getting about the character. The audience is interested in getting about the action that leads to excite, pity, and fear. Purification. The result is in purification, purgation, purification of soul. And that's why plot is the most primary, essential part of any tragedy that Aristotle confirms. That's why what we discussed today, what we pointed out today, is that there is an important element. Plot is the most important element of tragedy. If you approach it from the way that how, why this plot is important from the perception of character, from the point of view of language, from the point of view of how tragedy is possible, is impossible without plot, but tragedy can be possible without character because character is dispensable. character is not having any of his own choice. The character has to look after, the character has to understand, the character has to reach with his own way with the help of this particular action that leads to its ultimate aim. And that's why Aristotle very categorically, Aristotle very sensitive, Aristotle putting all the arguments together, giving an equation that tragedy is the most tragedy requires or is the most important part of tragedy is plot. And that's why Aristotle further in from chapter number 17, 7 to 14, in the whole 7, 8 chapters, Aristotle has devoted all these 8 chapters from 7 to 14. All these chapters he has devoted almost entirely to an analysis of plot. That makes us very clear that how plot is important in understanding of any tragedy. How plot is most essential part of tragedy. The space Aristotle has allocated to explain the plot to his readers makes it very clear that Aristotle is emphasizing continuously on plot when he talks about tragedy. Now, from chapter number 7 to 14, when he is analyzing, there are three stages in this analysis. In the analysis of plot, or what exactly is the basics of the plots. From chapter number 7 to 14, he is analyzing it with three different stages. Chapter number 7 to 9 specify the minimum conditions which any plot must satisfy if it is to be well formed. From chapter number 7 to 9, chapters 7 to 9 specify the minimum conditions which any plot must satisfy if it is to be well formed. Then the end of chapter 9 and the next two chapters distinguish two kinds of plots, simple and complex. And Aristotle claims that complex plots are superior than the simpler plots. Look at how much focus Aristotle has given to understanding of plot. Chapter 7 to 9, he is focusing on the minimum conditions of any plot to be well formed, well crafted plot. What would be the minimum conditions? He talked in two chapters, three chapters, 7, 8, 9. And by the end of ninth chapter, he come to conclusion that there are two kinds of plots, simple plot and complex plot, where Aristotle is giving weightage to complex plot over simple plot. And this part of discussion moves beyond the minimum condition required for any plot and begins to consider what makes one well formed plot better than another. By the end of chapter 9, he distinguished two kinds of plot: simple plot, complex plot. He gave weightage to complex plot, and this discussion leads further that what are the minimum requirement, what are the minimum conditions required of any plot, and begins to consider that what makes one well formed plot better than another. And this question is tackled more systematically in chapter 13 and 14, which addresses the question of the best kind of tragic plot. That's why I said uh, the analysis he gave of plot in three different stages. First stage, what are the minimum conditions which any plot must satisfy if it is to be a well formed? Second stage, that the plot, or what are the minimum conditions required of any plot, and begins to consider what makes one well formed plot better than another by giving a distinguished analysis of simple plot and complex plot. And what exactly is the best kind of tragic plot? He's coming to a conclusion. That's why I said at the beginning of the Poetics that Aristotle used mathematics a lot in making the readers to understand the whole process of techne, using the mathematical way to analyze everything step by step and making the readers to understand that what exactly he wants to talk about. Now we will discuss the further things, how this enters, how he talks about plots in different stages. We'll talk this on Monday, because if I start to talk about all those things, I'm worried that we are forgetting earlier concepts, techne and imitation, and how he analyzed the tragedy and how tragedy is leading towards. It may get little bit difficult for us to remember and to keep it in our writings. So we should stop here by understanding that he has analyzed those three stages, and we will discuss those three stages on